So in this video, I'm going to introduce some of the crucial ethical principles that have been developed and enshrined in various laws to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes again in future research with human participants. So the first ethical principle is that participants should be involved in a voluntary capacity, involved by choice, which also means the ability to withdraw from a study at any time. Yeah, even halfway through a big, complicated, expensive study when a bunch of time and money has been invested. They can always leave. They always have the choice. Another principle is the importance of getting what we call informed consent. You, the researcher, must tell the person what they will do and experience in the study. Give them an idea what the study is about and, roughly the kinds of things they'll go through if they participate. You have to inform them of any risks of possible harm that can be foreseen. And you have to explicitly make clear to them that they can stop at any time. Now, just as a side note, just to be clear, informed consent is not the same thing as what we might call educated consent, where they would fully understand everything, every detail about the experiment and why it was being done at the same level of understanding as the researchers. That may not be possible in many cases, but it also isn't considered necessary if there is at least informed consent. Now, there's also a right to privacy, meaning their information or personal details or their data should not be shared without consent. So specifically, most research with human subjects should at least provide confidentiality. Confidential meaning their information is kept secret. Like, the researcher may know that participant 82644 is Julio Smith, but that information is protected. It's not shared with anyone, kind of similar to medical records. Even better, where it's possible, is making the data anonymous. So you go beyond confidential to a higher level of privacy, what we'll call anonymous, meaning the person's identity is kept separate from their data or even kind of destroyed, so there's no connection. Even the researcher can't figure out whose data is whose. So in that case, you as the researcher, maybe you don't take their names at all, or you use codes and you destroy the code that connects to the names. You get rid of personal information as soon as possible. An example of this might be a researcher who was studying aggregated medical records, collecting all the data from a bunch of hospital systems, where they immediately, as they're getting that data out of the computer system, they're removing the personally identifiable information, like the names and such. Now you might ask then, what about something like naturalistic observation out in public? After all, people being watched unobtrusively out in the wild don't have any opportunity to consent. They don't even know they're being studied, so they can't give informed consent. Now there are in fact ethical guidelines for how to do something like this in a way that's considered okay, only in some circumstances. But I encourage you to maybe pause the video a moment and think about what you would consider important for determining an okay naturalistic observation from one that is not okay. Another question you might think about is collecting aggregate information, like from businesses or government data or things like that. Just to give a fun little example, there is a hypothesized thing called the name-letter effect, where the hypothesis suggests that people psychologically prefer the letters in their own name without being aware of it. And so someone whose name starts with M might be slightly more likely to work at McDonald's than someone whose name starts with B, who might in turn be slightly more likely to work at Burger King. Now, one well-known study that was testing this effect involved looking at data that was shared by the Belgian government, where they actually shared the names of citizens plus the names of those citizens' employers. Now, the researchers didn't share that. They didn't publish that publicly in their paper, but they used that information to study this. Much more kind of ubiquitous and common today is research done on data collected from businesses. So originally that was things like grocery store loyalty cards, where they sold your data on all your buying patterns to all sorts of buyers. But researchers could also purchase that data and do their studies on that data. So if you wanted to do marketing psychology studies or things like that. Ditto for credit card spending. Now nowadays, just about anything you do online and much of what you do offline is tracked heavily and shared with and by giant data broker companies for purposes like targeted marketing. So should researchers study this information if it's aggregated to remove personally identifiable information? Is that ethically okay? Even if the participants in question don't realize at all the extent to which they're being tracked and spied upon, like with hidden tracking pixels and all sorts of websites or a million other little tricks. Some of these details, these ethical details and discussions are still being debated in the area of research ethics today. But for now, let's move on to from the right to privacy to a big one, which is the right to not be harmed. if someone participates in a study, they should definitely not come away worse for it. If we want to study, phantom limbs, we should not be chopping off the previously healthy limbs of half of our participants, even if they got assigned to the phantom limb condition. But crucially, this also means to avoid psychological harm. Specifically, it's most important to avoid lasting harm, whether we're talking about the physical kind or the psychological kind. So meaning we may deem it okay on balance to put someone through a very mild discomfort that they have agreed to, but we shouldn't scar someone for life or create new traumas with our research. Of course, if there is any harm that's kind of deemed, acceptable for this study, great effort should go into minimizing that harm. And of course, any harm should only be allowed if it's absolutely necessary to answer the research question, and if the research question is important enough. And again, get informed consent in that case. Like if there is any harm or risk of harm, they should be signing up knowingly for any risk that they take, even for what may seem like temporary or minor issues to us, the scientist. Now, to give you an example of the kinds of decisions that have to be weighed by researchers and by those, considering approving their studies, I'd mention maybe the International Affective Picture System. Affective meaning emotional. So this is a standardized set of pictures that previous research has shown will consistently cause certain emotional reactions in participants. So using it lets us manipulate emotions or emotional arousal during the experiment in order to test all sorts of interesting and important hypotheses, like studying, how the amygdala in the brain works or helping those with PTSD. But using those images in a study involves showing participants pictures of mutilation, death, torture, sex, and all sorts of other things. It is hard to forget. Many participants who have been in such a study will remember some of those pictures later on. So we need to think about the amount of possible psychological harm at stake, but also weigh it against the benefits to society and helping people. So we need to make a judgment call of when the benefits make this level of risk, and I mean with informed consent here, make this level of risk ethical to undertake. But we've seen before that scientists may have a little too much conflict of interest to judge whether their own study is ethical, so we need some more impartial third parties. And that is why research on humans, and on animals too for that matter, nowadays goes through an ethics board for approval before it can be done. Legally speaking, the United States has many different protections for research participants coming from multiple different laws and regulations, but one of the most important is the establishment of institutional review boards, or IRBs. So universities, governments, and other institutions, including private companies doing what's considered scientific research on people, must form a review board. And it's made up of scientists, yes, but also community members whose primary concern is non-scientific, which could include like an ethicist or a lawyer or a member of the clergy. Also someone not affiliated with the organization at all. And in the case of animal review boards, you have like a veterinarian required. And then a researcher would submit any proposed experiments before doing them. And the IRB judges the legality and the ethics of the proposals. Someone is there explicitly just to represent the perspective of research participants. The board has to have varying backgrounds. It can't be all male or all female. It's really meant to be an array of voices that aren't as biased in the way, the researchers themselves might be in some worst case scenario. And indeed, if you want to do a research study and share it with the world, whether that's in a peer-reviewed journal or at a scientific conference or on your blog, legally speaking, you need IRB approval to do any studies on humans. That doesn't mean that you need IRB approval as a third grade teacher if you're just collecting some data on your own pupils' performance to see if your new pedagogical trick works well for teaching math. If you're just collecting that data internally, not to be shared with the world at a conference or in a paper or anything, if you're just collecting data to improve internal processes or something like that, you don't need IRB approval. You still need to follow all other applicable laws, of course. You can't hurt people, you can't assault them, things like that. But if you're doing it for science, if you're doing what the law considers research, like you're going to share this information, this knowledge with the world, you need, legally speaking, an IRB, Institutional Review Board, to okay it first, or you're breaking the law. Now, in the next video, I'll talk a little about some more ethical details that can be particularly important in social science research.